1860, our nation had grown and evolved to the point where there were two starkly different cultures and ways of life existing in the same country. Now, the northern states had evolved by this time into modern cities by 1860 standards. They had transportation systems, they had stores, they had heavy populated areas, and they had factories. The northern economy was based on industry. And what were they making in those factories? Well, chiefly textiles. They were producing fabrics, cloth, rugs, curtains, tapestries, items that were made primarily of cotton. And there was a big demand for those textiles. So the northern economy was flourishing because of these factories. Now the southern economy, there's the southern states, was not as populated. It was rural. There weren't big cities, and it was based on agriculture or farming. And the chief crop that was coming out of the South at that time was cotton. There was a big demand for cotton because of those textile industries in the North. Now, here's the thing. The northern industries wanted that cotton, but they wanted it cheap because the cheaper they could get it, the bigger profit they could turn. And if the southern states couldn't provide that cotton cheaply enough, the northern states would just buy it from Europe. And that would really put a damper on the southern economy. So there was a lot of pressure in the South to produce that cotton and provide it cheaply. And the way they were going to do that was with slave labor. Now, slavery is one of those things in American history that we wish we could erase, that we wish we could forget about, but we can't. It's a dark stain in our nation's past, and we have to learn about it to prevent from making mistakes in the future that are just as bad. Now, from the time that Tennessee was a state, the very first people came into Tennessee in the Appalachian region, they brought slaves with them. By 1860, our boundaries as a state were well established and had been for some time, and three clearly defined regions based on geography were in existence. Now, in East Tennessee were the Appalachian Mountains, and there wasn't much demand for slave labor in the Appalachian Mountains because you're not going to farm there on a large scale. So there really weren't that many slaves in eastern Tennessee. When you come over to Middle Tennessee, and you've got the rolling hills, and there were a lot of tobacco farms and cattle farms, there were more slaves living in the Middle Tennessee area. But when you get to West Tennessee, the concentration of slavery was going to be at its highest. And that's because there were lots of cotton farms and plantations in the western part of the state, and that's where the demand for slave labor was going to be the highest. You can look at this pie graph, and you can get a feel for the proportion of black and white populations in Tennessee in 1860. And Eastern Tennessee has the least amount of slaves, and then there's Middle Tennessee. And when you get to Western Tennessee, you can see it really goes up. By 1860, 1 in 4 people living in the state of Tennessee was a slave. Now, sometimes when we think about the antebellum period, and antebellum just means before the war, the Civil War, we think that everyone owned slaves and there were slaves everywhere, but that's simply not true. Look at the state of Tennessee as an example. In 1860, there was 1 person in the state of Tennessee who owned more than 300 slaves. There were 47 people in the whole state who owned more than 100 slaves. And the rest of the people owned fewer than 10. And even with that, only 25% of people in the state of Tennessee owned a slave at all. So really, the slaves in Tennessee were concentrated on a very few farms, mostly in middle and western Tennessee, and 75% of people in the state didn't own a slave at all. Now, let's talk about what those slaves did. They did everything. Whatever job there was on a large farm or plantation, there was a slave to perform that task. Now, some of the slaves were skilled tradesmen, having been taught to be blacksmiths. They were carpenters. They tended livestock. They were cooks. They were house cleaners. They worked in the field. They did everything. They even helped build the Tennessee State Capitol. Now, I want you to hear how a slave recalls his days growing up. And this is from a book called Remembering Slavery. And this book was put together based on recordings that were made in the 1930s when we tried to preserve the memories of people who had been slaves and were still alive. And listen to how this man describes it. I was born in Louisiana around the year of 1857, so they tell me. My mama died when I was 2 years old. I was raised by my aunt. She started me out washing dishes when I was 4, and when I was 6, she was learning me how to cook. And while the other slaves were out working in the field, I carried water. We had to cook out in the yard on an old skillet and lid, so you see I had to tote the brush and the bark and roll up little logs such as I could to keep that fire from going. I wasn't but 6 years old doing that. When I got to be 7, I was cutting sprouts like a man could, and when I was 8, I could pick 100 pounds of cotton. When it rained and we couldn't go work in the field, we had to spin thread to make socks and cloth. I had to card the bats and make the rolls to spin. Now, we lived on the edge of the field. I was born a slave and I didn't know any different. Our wash tubs and our water buckets and our bread trays were made out of logs, dug out with some kind of axe. I would carry wet clothes to a stump and beat them with a stick, and we would hang them clothes on a brush. All my young days, all I ever wore was homespun clothes. We lived in a little log cabin with a dirt floor, and our bed was just some poles knotted up against the wall, and we pulled grass to make a mattress. So that's how he recalls his time of slavery. And I thought you might be interested in seeing this. This is a photograph of a woman who was a slave on John Bell's plantation in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And here's another photograph. This is a husband and wife who were also slaves in Tennessee. Now, slaves lived under a terrible umbrella of oppression. They didn't know their birthdays. They lived under constant fear of being sold away from their families. In fact, here is the memory or the thoughts of one woman, and she says, after she's free, there's her photograph. She says, I done lost my people. They was sold away from me, and I ain't ever going to get to see them no more in this world. Because there was no way then, even in the 1930s, to track down people who had been sold away in slavery from their family members. They couldn't read or write because they were kept under oppression. So really anything that makes you a human, your family, your birthday, your knowledge, was purposefully kept away from people who were held as slaves. Now, sometimes we try to make things better than they were, and we like to think, well, there were people who were nice to their slaves, right? Well, how could you be nice and own another person? Let me tell you what a slave said about it. He said, you can take anything. It don't matter how good you treat it. It wants to be free. You can treat it good, and you can feed it good, and you can feel good about yourself for doing that. You can get it anything it wants, everything it wants. But if you open the door to its cage, it's going to go for freedom. Now, slavery was going to be a divisive factor in this nation in the years leading up to the Civil War. And Slavery was almost going to tear the state of Tennessee in two when Tennessee had to decide which side of history the state was going to fall upon when the time came. Were we going to continue and fight to protect our lives as a slave state, or were we going to go with the Union North after Abraham Lincoln was elected and try to keep this nation together?